Most people assume that when something is good for them, their mind should naturally move toward it. But strangely, the opposite often happens. The things that would genuinely help you think clearer, feel calmer, or move forward are often the very things your mind resists the most. This isn't laziness, it isn't weakness, and it definitely isn't a character flaw. What you're experiencing is actually a protective mechanism working exactly as it was designed to. Your brain does not measure what is helpful, it measures what is safe. And safety to your mind does not mean progress. Safety means familiar. The problem is that progress almost always feels unfamiliar at first. So when something could genuinely improve your life, your brain may interpret it not as opportunity but as risk. That's why people sometimes avoid what would help them most, while staying stuck in patterns they already know aren't working. This is where many people become confused about themselves. They believe that if something is beneficial, they should feel motivated to do it. So when they don't feel that motivation, they assume something is wrong with them. But the absence of motivation is not a failure signal. It's a protection signal. Your brain is constantly scanning for uncertainty, and anything unfamiliar is flagged as potentially dangerous. Even positive change can trigger this response. Starting something new, thinking differently, or letting go of an old habit all introduce uncertainty. And uncertainty from your brain's perspective looks very similar to threat. So instead of encouraging you toward helpful action, your mind quietly slows you down. It creates hesitation, doubt, or distraction. Not because it wants you to fail, but because its primary goal is stability. Understanding this changes everything, because it means resistance isn't a personal flaw. It's a predictable psychological pattern. Help often feels threatening because it implies change. And change means leaving behind something familiar, even if that familiar thing is uncomfortable. Your brain would rather keep you in a known discomfort than move you toward an unknown improvement. That sounds irrational, but from a survival perspective, it makes perfect sense. The known environment has already been tested. The unknown has not. So when something appears that could help you grow, heal, or improve, your mind doesn't instantly celebrate. Instead, it pauses. It evaluates. It questions. Sometimes it resists. Not because the opportunity is bad, but because it hasn't yet been proven safe. Until your brain gathers enough evidence that something new won't harm you, it treats that thing with caution. This is why people often delay helpful actions while telling themselves they'll start later. The delay isn't random. It's psychological self-protection. Your brain has one job above all others: keep you alive. Happiness is optional. Growth is optional. Confidence is optional. Survival is not. So your nervous system is designed to prioritize stability over improvement. This means your mind will almost always choose the option that feels safest in the moment, even if it's not the option that's best long-term. The safest option is usually the one you already know. That's why familiar habits feel easier than new ones. Familiar thoughts feel more believable than new perspectives, and familiar behaviors feel more comfortable than change. Your brain isn't asking, will this help me? It's asking, is this predictable? If the answer is no, resistance appears. This isn't sabotage. It's caution. Your mind is simply trying to protect you from uncertainty, the only way it knows how, by slowing you down whenever something feels unfamiliar. Resistance is often misinterpreted as a stop sign. But psychologically, it's actually feedback. When you feel resistance towards something helpful, your brain isn't saying, don't do this. It's saying, this is new. That distinction matters, because if you treat resistance like danger, you'll avoid growth. But if you treat resistance like information, you begin to understand what your mind is reacting to. Resistance shows you where uncertainty lives. It points to the exact edge of your comfort zone. And that edge is where most meaningful change begins. People who misunderstand resistance think it means they're not ready. People who understand resistance realize it means they're encountering something unfamiliar. The feeling is the same. The interpretation is different. And that interpretation determines whether someone stays stuck or moves forward. The sensation of hesitation isn't a signal to stop. It's a signal that something new is happening. The human brain builds preference through repetition. The more often you experience something, the more normal it feels. This applies to everything. Environments, routines, thoughts, even emotions. If you've repeated a pattern long enough, your brain begins to label it as safe simply because it recognizes it. That means even unhelpful patterns can feel comfortable if they're familiar, and helpful changes can feel uncomfortable if they're new. This creates what psychologists sometimes call a familiarity trap. You don't stay in a pattern because it's good. You stay because it's known. The brain confuses recognition with safety, so when something unfamiliar appears, even if it could improve your life, your mind instinctively leans back toward what it already understands. This isn't self-sabotage, it's pattern loyalty. Your brain prefers the predictable over the beneficial until the beneficial becomes predictable too. Understanding something logically does not automatically change how your brain responds emotionally. You can know that something is good for you and still feel resistance toward it. That's because logic and survival instincts operate through different systems in the mind. Logic evaluates outcomes. Survival evaluates risk. And survival always speaks louder. This is why simply knowing what would help you doesn't always make you do it. Information alone doesn't override instinct. Your brain still needs to experience something enough times to recognize it as safe. Until then, hesitation can remain, even when you fully understand what you should do. This is not a contradiction. It's how the mind works. Insight creates awareness. Repetition creates safety. Without repetition, even helpful actions can continue to feel difficult. The mind doesn't change because something makes sense. It changes because something becomes familiar. When helpful actions feel uncomfortable, people often experience an internal conflict. One part of the mind wants progress. Another part wants safety. Both are trying to help you, but they're using different rules. The progress-oriented part focuses on possibility. The safety-oriented part focuses on certainty. When certainty is missing, safety usually wins. That's why someone can genuinely want change while simultaneously avoiding it. They're not contradicting themselves. They're experiencing two systems operating at once. This internal tension is often mistaken for lack of discipline or lack of desire, but in reality, it's a negotiation between competing priorities inside the mind. The desire to grow isn't gone. It's just being moderated by the desire to stay safe. Once you understand that, hesitation stops feeling like failure and starts looking like a natural psychological balancing process. When people notice resistance, their first instinct is often to push harder against it. They try to force themselves forward through pressure, urgency, or self-criticism. But pressure doesn't convince the brain something is safe. Pressure convinces it something is dangerous. The more force you apply, the more your nervous system interprets the situation as a threat. This is why harsh motivation rarely lasts. It creates tension instead of safety, and tension tells your brain to protect you, not expand you. So instead of helping you move forward, force can actually strengthen the very resistance you're trying to overcome. Your mind tightens its grip on familiar patterns because those patterns suddenly feel even safer by comparison. The paradox is that the harder you push, the more stuck you can feel. Not because you're failing, but because your brain is doing its job, protecting you from what it perceives as pressure. Another reason helpful change feels difficult is speed. The brain prefers gradual shifts, not sudden ones. Rapid change creates uncertainty spikes, and uncertainty activates caution systems. When change happens slowly, your mind has time to adjust and update its safety predictions. But when change happens quickly, your brain can't process it fast enough to feel secure. So it reacts with hesitation or avoidance. This is why dramatic transformations are rare, but small consistent shifts often succeed. The nervous system trusts what it can track. It distrusts what appears suddenly. People sometimes think they need a burst of intensity to improve their lives, but psychologically, intensity often triggers resistance. Slow exposure, repetition, and familiarity are what actually retrain the brain's sense of safety. Progress that feels calm is progress your mind can accept, and progress your mind accepts is progress it allows to continue. Before your mind allows change, it looks for evidence of safety. That evidence usually comes from repetition. Each time you repeat a new behavior or experience, your brain gathers data. If nothing harmful happens, the brain slightly lowers its guard. Over time, what once felt unfamiliar begins to feel normal. This is how your nervous system updates its definition of safe. But until enough evidence is collected, hesitation can remain. That hesitation isn't a refusal, it's a waiting period. Your brain is observing, measuring, and deciding whether the new experience belongs in the category of safe or unsafe. The more consistent the experience, the faster this update happens. This is why steady exposure changes people more effectively than sudden effort. Safety is not decided instantly, it's learned gradually. And once something becomes familiar enough, resistance often fades without force, simply because your mind now recognizes it. People often assume comfort means something is good for them. But comfort doesn't measure benefit. Comfort measures familiarity. Something can be comfortable and harmful, or uncomfortable and helpful. The feeling itself doesn't tell you which is which. Your brain produces comfort when it recognizes patterns it already understands. That recognition reduces uncertainty, and reduced uncertainty feels safe. But growth rarely begins in recognition. It begins in novelty. So the early stages of improvement often feel uncomfortable, not because they're wrong, but because they're new. If someone expects helpful things to feel comfortable immediately, they may abandon them too early, not because the change doesn't work, but because their brain hasn't yet adapted to it. Comfort is not proof of correctness, it's proof of familiarity, and familiarity takes time. The moment something helpful becomes familiar, it usually becomes easier as well. Waiting often feels reasonable because your brain interprets delay as caution, and caution feels safe. When you postpone something unfamiliar, your nervous system relaxes slightly because uncertainty has been removed. That relief can make waiting feel like the correct decision, even if it prevents progress. This is why people sometimes convince themselves they'll start later. The promise of later reduces pressure now, but later rarely arrives on its own. The mind isn't trying to deceive you when it suggests waiting. It's trying to reduce uncertainty. From a survival perspective, delay is safer than risk. So hesitation can feel logical, even when it keeps you stuck. Understanding this helps explain why avoidance can feel strangely comforting. It's not that avoidance is good, it's that avoidance removes uncertainty, and your brain prefers certainty above almost everything else, especially when something new is involved. People often believe they need more energy before they can begin something helpful. But energy is rarely what's missing. Familiarity is. When something feels unfamiliar, your brain interprets it as effortful. Effort signals uncertainty, and uncertainty signals risk. So the task feels heavier than it actually is. This creates the illusion that you lack energy, when in reality your nervous system is resisting unfamiliar territory. Once something becomes familiar, the same task can suddenly feel easier, even if the physical effort hasn't changed at all. The difference isn't strength, it's recognition. Your brain stops sounding alarms once it understands what's happening. This is why repetition reduces perceived effort. The action hasn't changed, but your mind's interpretation of it has. What once felt difficult can start to feel natural simply because it's no longer new. Familiarity lowers resistance more effectively than motivation ever could. Your brain doesn't automatically trust new experiences. Trust is built through exposure. Every repeated experience acts like a vote telling your nervous system whether something is safe. At first, new actions receive very few votes, so the brain treats them cautiously. But each time the action is repeated without negative consequences, another vote is added. Slowly, trust increases. Eventually, the unfamiliar becomes recognized, and once recognized, it becomes easier to approach. This is why consistency matters more than intensity. Intensity can't create trust instantly. Trust requires proof, and proof requires repetition. When people abandon something helpful too quickly, it's often because they expected trust to exist before evidence appeared. But your brain doesn't operate on expectations. It operates on experience. The more experiences it gathers, the more confident it becomes. Confidence is not created by thinking differently. It's created by encountering something enough times that your mind stops seeing it as unknown. Small changes succeed more often than large ones because they don't alarm the brain. Tiny adjustments feel manageable, predictable, and trackable. That predictability tells your nervous system there's no immediate threat. Large, sudden changes, on the other hand, create uncertainty spikes. And uncertainty spikes trigger resistance. This is why gradual progress often outperforms dramatic attempts. Small steps allow the brain to update its safety map slowly. Each step confirms that nothing dangerous is happening. Over time, those confirmations accumulate, and once enough evidence exists, the mind stops resisting. The change doesn't feel threatening anymore, it feels normal. People sometimes underestimate small progress because it looks insignificant in the moment. But psychologically, small progress is powerful because it teaches the brain that new experiences can be safe. And once the brain accepts something as safe, it no longer tries to block it. Your brain is constantly predicting what will happen next. It prefers situations where outcomes are easy to anticipate. Predictable environments require less energy and feel safer. Unpredictable ones demand more attention and feel risky. When something helpful enters your life, your brain doesn't yet know how it will unfold. Without a prediction, it becomes cautious. That caution can feel like doubt or hesitation, not because the opportunity is wrong, but because the outcome is unknown. Once your brain has seen the same situation enough times, it can finally predict it. And once it can predict it, it can relax. Prediction reduces uncertainty. Reduced uncertainty increases comfort. This is why repeated exposure changes emotional reactions. The event hasn't changed, your brain's prediction has, and when prediction becomes clear, resistance often disappears without effort. The mind no longer sees the situation as unfamiliar. Watching others move forward easily can make someone feel like they're falling behind. But comparison ignores one important fact. You can't see someone else's familiarity level. What looks easy for them may simply be something their brain already recognizes. Their nervous system has already gathered evidence that the situation is safe. Yours may still be evaluating it. The difference isn't ability, it's exposure. When people compare themselves without considering this, they often misjudge their own progress. They assume difficulty means they're doing something wrong. In reality, difficulty often just means something is new. Once the experience repeats enough times, what felt difficult can begin to feel natural. Progress isn't only about movement, it's about adaptation. And adaptation takes time. The mind changes gradually as it gathers proof. Comparing different stages of familiarity can make someone misunderstand their own process entirely. Resistance often appears strongest right before something becomes familiar. This is because the brain is closest to the edge of the unknown. At that moment, it has gathered some information, but not enough to feel certain. That middle stage can feel especially uncomfortable. Many people interpret this discomfort as a sign they should stop. But psychologically, it often means the brain is in the process of updating its safety map. The paradox is that the point where resistance feels strongest is sometimes the point where adaptation is closest. If someone steps away too early, the brain never gathers the final evidence it needs to relax, so the unfamiliar stays unfamiliar. But if exposure continues calmly, the nervous system eventually adjusts. The discomfort fades not because the situation changed, but because the brain finally understands it. Familiarity, once established, quietly replaces resistance. Your mind is not trying to hold you back, it's trying to protect you from uncertainty. Every hesitation, every moment of doubt, every impulse to delay is your nervous system asking one question: is this safe? That question operates automatically. It doesn't require your permission. And it doesn't care whether something is helpful or not. It only cares whether it's predictable. Once something becomes predictable, the brain allows it. Until then, it evaluates it. This means resistance is not an obstacle placed in your way. It's a checkpoint built into your biology. Understanding this removes the personal judgment people often place on themselves. You're not failing when something feels hard. You're encountering something your brain hasn't fully mapped yet. The difficulty is informational, not personal. It's simply showing you where your mind is still learning what is safe. When you stop seeing resistance as a flaw and start seeing it as feedback, your relationship with difficulty changes. Instead of fighting your mind, you begin understanding it, and understanding reduces frustration. You realize hesitation is not an enemy. It's information. It tells you where unfamiliarity exists. Once you see it this way, you no longer need to panic when something feels hard. Difficulty stops meaning something is wrong. It starts meaning something is new. That shift in interpretation is powerful because it removes unnecessary pressure. Your brain doesn't need force. It needs familiarity, and familiarity comes from repeated exposure, not urgency. When people grasp this, they often feel calmer about their own progress. They stop demanding instant comfort and start allowing gradual adaptation. That patience gives the nervous system the time it needs to update its predictions and recognize new experiences as safe. So, if something that could help you feels strangely difficult, that doesn't mean you're incapable. It doesn't mean you lack discipline. And it doesn't mean you're doing anything wrong. It usually means your brain hasn't seen that experience enough times yet to recognize it as safe. What feels hard today can feel natural later, not because you forced yourself, but because your mind learned. The brain always prefers the familiar over the unfamiliar, until the unfamiliar becomes familiar too, and that process happens quietly, through repetition, exposure, and time. Understanding this doesn't give you pressure. It gives you clarity, because once you see how your mind works, you stop fighting it. And when you stop fighting your mind, you can finally work with it instead.